They said a slave could never own the land that once broke him. They said chains once worn would never leave a man's soul. But in the deep heart of Georgia, under the sweltering sun of 1829, one man rewrote that fate in blood and fire. His name was Moses, and his story became both a whispered warning and a legend the South could never bury. For years, Moses had lived as nothing more than a shadow, strong hands that plowed the fields, a back that carried others' sins, and eyes that never dared to rise above his master's boots. He was known for his silence, for never showing defiance, and for bearing the pain of whips without a sound. But those who looked deeper saw something burning behind that quiet, the same fire that could melt iron. His master, Colonel Abram Wren, was a cruel man who believed pain was order and power was divine right. The plantation stretched for miles, rows of cotton like white graves beneath the August heat. Moses was the strongest among them, but strength meant nothing in a world that measured worth by skin. The colonel saw in him both usefulness and danger, and so he made sure Moses remembered his place every single day. But something shifted the day the colonel's wife, Eleanor Wren, began to notice the quiet giant who never looked her in the eye. She saw the way he worked without rest, the way he carried wounds that never healed. At first, it was pity, then fascination, then something even darker, something neither of them dared to name. It was wrong by every law written by man and God, but the South had always been built on the sins no one spoke of aloud. The breaking point came one night when the colonel, drunk on bourbon and hate, dragged Moses from his quarters after finding a piece of Eleanor's shawl near the slave cabins. He beat Moses until blood mixed with the dirt, cursing him for crimes he hadn't yet committed. That night, under a blood-red moon, something ancient awoke inside the man who had spent his life kneeling. By morning, the plantation smelled of smoke and death. The colonel's body was found near the stables, his skull crushed by the very hammer he'd once used to mark his slaves. No one saw who did it, but everyone knew. The mistress didn't cry. Instead, she told the sheriff that bandits had attacked in the night, killing her husband and stealing his horses. Only Moses stood behind her when she spoke, his face unreadable, his eyes calm. The whispers began the next day. Some said the widow had gone mad, others that she'd made a deal with the devil himself. Yet no one dared question her when, months later, she freed Moses and announced her plans to marry him. The world recoiled. Preachers called it blasphemy. Neighbors turned away, and men spat at the ground where they walked. But Eleanor stood firm beside him, and Moses, once a slave, now became master of the very land that had once held his chains. Together, they rebuilt the plantation, not for profit, but as a sanctuary for those who had no home. Former slaves found refuge there, given work, dignity, and protection. Moses never raised his hand in cruelty, though he carried the memory of every lash in silence. His presence alone was enough to keep lawmen and bounty hunters from crossing the gate. But peace in those times never lasted long. The South could not stand the sight of a black man ruling the soil of his former master, nor a white woman standing beside him. The legend says the night riders came, torches in hand, to burn his home and reclaim their pride. Yet when they reached the gate, they found the fields empty, the house cold, the people gone. Some swore they saw Moses standing in the field, eyes burning like coals, watching as the flames devoured the land. No one ever found their bodies. Only a single gravestone remained years later, blank, weathered, and silent. But travelers still tell of a man and woman seen at dusk, walking hand in hand through the old Georgia fields, as if guarding something sacred. That is the story of Moses the legend, the man who killed his master, married the widow, and became a symbol of vengeance, love, and the impossible dream of freedom in a world built to destroy it. His tale was whispered in songs, carved in secret letters, and passed from one generation to the next, not as a crime, but as a reckoning. It began like any other southern night, heavy, slow, and wrapped in the thick humidity that clung to the air like sweat. But beneath the stillness of the Georgian dusk in 1829, something restless stirred inside Moses. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, a silence that hums in your bones, waiting for the moment when everything breaks. For years, Moses had lived in submission. He was the strongest man on the plantation, yet every ounce of that strength was owned by someone else. His back bore the stories of countless lashes, his hands were calloused from endless toil, and his soul was wrapped in chains no iron could match. Yet that night, As the cicadas sang their hollow song, the slave quarters felt different. Something unseen pressed against the air. Not fear this time, but tension, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Colonel Abram Wren had been drinking since sunset. His rage came in waves, unpredictable and vicious. Word spread through the quarters that he was searching for Moses again. Earlier that day, the mistress's shawl, white silk, embroidered with crimson thread, had been found hanging near Moses's workbench. The colonel didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in punishment. When they dragged Moses to the main house, he didn't resist. He'd learned long ago that fighting back only delayed the inevitable. The colonel stood on the porch, a pistol in one hand and a whip in the other, the veins in his neck swollen like ropes. Eleanor, pale and trembling, stood behind him, her lips pressed tight. The air smelled of bourbon and madness. "You think you can touch what's mine?" The colonel spat, his voice sharp as glass. Moses didn't answer. He didn't look at the man, or at the woman behind him. He simply stood there, the flickering lantern light catching the sweat on his skin. The colonel's fury grew. He struck Moses across the face with the whip once, twice, again. The sound cracked through the night like lightning, each lash drawing blood, and yet no sound came from the man receiving them. That silence was what broke him. "Look at me, damn you!" the colonel shouted. But Moses didn't. His stillness wasn't defiance, it was power. The colonel felt it, though he couldn't name it. That was the moment something shifted. Eleanor stepped forward, desperate. "Abram, please, he didn't do anything!" But her voice was swallowed by another strike, this one harder, crueler. The whip tore skin, blood darkened the dirt. When the colonel finally grew tired, he tossed the whip aside and pulled his pistol. "I'll end this tonight," he growled. And that's when everything froze. The world seemed to hold still as the pistol cocked. In that single heartbeat, something inside Moses, buried under years of suffering, cracked open. The still air suddenly carried the scent of smoke. Somewhere distant, thunder rolled. The colonel sneered and pulled the trigger. The hammer fell, but no shot came. The pistol misfired. Eleanor screamed. The colonel cursed, fumbling to reload. But before he could, Moses moved. It was like watching a force of nature break free. He lunged forward, grabbing the colonel's wrist. The sound of bone snapping echoed across the porch. The pistol fell to the ground. The colonel cried out, but Moses didn't stop. Years of rage poured through him. The rage of every whip, every order, every stolen breath. His hands found the colonel's throat, and in that moment, he was no longer a man avenging himself. He was a reckoning for centuries of silence. The struggle was short. The colonel fought, clawed, begged, but Moses' strength was something holy and terrible. When it was over, the colonel lay still, the firelight casting his shadow across the blood-stained boards. Moses stood over him, breathing hard, his face unreadable. Eleanor trembled, tears streaming down her face, not from fear but from shock, relief, and horror tangled together. She whispered his name, Moses. He turned to her. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was heavy with the weight of what had just happened. He had done what every enslaved soul dreamed of but never dared. He had killed his master. Then came the fire. It began in the stables. No one ever knew who lit the first flame. Some said Moses himself, others swore it was Eleanor. But within minutes, the night sky turned red. The plantation, once proud and whitewashed, became a burning monument to everything it had stood for. The fields glowed, the cotton catching like tinder, the smell of smoke mingling with the cries of those who ran for their lives. Through the chaos, Moses walked like a ghost, calm, focused, unstoppable. He didn't flee. He gathered the others, the ones who had lived in fear beside him, and led them out through the marshes. The flames reflected in his eyes as he turned back one last time. Behind him, the world that had tried to crush him was reduced to ash. When dawn came, the plantation was gone. The colonel's body was found near the porch, his skull shattered. The sheriff arrived by midday, but Eleanor met him with calm poise and tear-streaked cheeks. "Bandits," she said softly, her voice steady. "They killed my husband. Moses saved me." The sheriff didn't question her. No one dared. That night, Moses and Eleanor buried the past beneath the smoking ruins. He could have run north, disappeared, and lived free. But he didn't. Instead, he stayed. Together, they rebuilt what had been destroyed, not as master and slave, not even as man and mistress, but as two souls bound by what they had survived. The world would never understand what happened that night. How violence had birthed something like redemption, or how two broken people found their humanity amid the ashes. But those who lived to tell the story said the fire on the plantation was more than destruction. It was a cleansing, a purging of generations of sin, and when the smoke cleared, only one man stood among the ruins. A man no longer bound by the name given to him, but by the one he earned. Moses, the survivor, the liberator, the legend. When the fire died down and the ashes cooled, silence fell over the remains of the Wren plantation. The air still smelled of smoke and blood, the soil blackened by the weight of what had happened. Conall Abram Wren was dead. The man who had ruled over hundreds now lay in an unmarked grave, buried by the very hands that had once obeyed his every command. But it wasn't his death that shook Georgia. It was what came after. Eleanor Wren was no ordinary woman. She had been born into wealth, privilege, and the unspoken expectations of a Southern lady. From childhood, she had been taught that her place was beside her husband, her words quiet, her hands folded, her loyalty unquestioned. Her beauty was delicate, her manner graceful. But beneath that softness was a mind sharper than any blade and a heart that had endured years of quiet torment. The night Moses killed her husband, Eleanor's life had ended too, or at least, the version of her that society knew. In the burning glow of her collapsing home, she had seen both the horror of death and the strange, undeniable spark of something else, freedom. For weeks after the fire, rumors spread through the county. Some said the widow had gone mad. Others whispered that she'd sold her soul to save her life. But when the sheriff came, Eleanor told her story with the calm precision of a woman who had decided long before how it must sound. She said that bandits had attacked, that her husband had died defending the plantation, that Moses, her late husband's most loyal servant, had saved her from the flames. Every word was a lie wrapped in truth, but her voice never trembled. The sheriff accepted it. No one questioned a grieving widow with eyes red from sleepless nights. No one wanted to touch the horror that hung over that house. So they buried the Conall quietly and left her to her mourning. But the whispers never stopped. Behind closed doors, Eleanor faced a truth even more dangerous than murder. She had fallen in love with the man she was supposed to own. Not a fleeting fascination, not the cruel indulgence that so many Southern women secretly allowed themselves under the safety of silence, but real soul-breaking love. It had begun long before the fire, long before the violence, in stolen glances and moments that defied everything the world believed possible. She had seen something in Moses that her husband never did: dignity, calm, an inner power that didn't need a title to command respect. And he, though bound in chains, saw something in her too, a spark of rebellion behind the polished manners, a woman quietly suffocating in the cage her society called grace. Now, with the plantation gone and the Conall dead, they stood alone in the ruins of both their worlds. Society expected her to remarry, to restore her name by aligning herself with another wealthy man, to rebuild the legacy of her late husband. But Eleanor made a choice that no woman of her time would dare. She chose Moses. It was not an easy decision. Every law, every scripture, every neighbor's whisper declared it a sin. The South would rather see her dead than see her walk beside a man once enslaved in her home. Yet Eleanor knew there was no going back. The moment she watched Moses bury the man who had owned them both in different ways, she realized that love, once born in fire, could not be buried in fear. She invited him into the house, not as a servant, but as an equal. Together they cleaned what the flames had spared. They rebuilt, board by board, room by room. The neighbors refused to visit. The church turned its back. But Eleanor didn't care. For the first time in her life, she was not living by someone else's rules. It was Moses who resisted at first. He knew the danger. He'd seen what men did to others like him. Men who dared to rise above their place, who dared to reach for what was forbidden. He told her she deserved safety, not scandal. But Eleanor looked him in the eyes and said softly, "I've lived my whole life in cages made of gold. I would rather die free beside you than live as another man's ornament." And so, one rain-soaked morning, in the quiet ruins of what had once been the grandest plantation in Georgia, a widow and a freed man stood before a wooden cross and spoke their vows in whispers. No priest, no witnesses, no paper, just a promise. She became his, and he became hers, bound not by law, but by something older and far more sacred. When word spread, outrage followed. White men called it blasphemy, white women called it madness, but no one dared confront them directly. The legend says that when men came riding in the night to drag Moses away, Eleanor stood on the porch with her late husband's pistol, her hand steady, her eyes clear. "The first man who takes another step," she said, "will join Abram in the earth." They left her alone after that. Over time, the scandal faded into myth. Some said she bewitched him, others claimed he controlled her through fear. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. They loved each other. And love, real, defiant, unbroken, was the one thing this world could never chain. Years later, travelers would pass through the old road near Wren's Crossing and see a house rebuilt among the ashes. They'd see a man and a woman tending the land together, their hands scarred, their faces calm. Some said the crops grew stronger on that soil, that the earth itself had forgiven the sins buried beneath it. Eleanor's choice wasn't just a scandal. It was an act of rebellion that history tried to erase. She had defied every law, every sermon, every whisper, and stood by a man the world told her to despise. She didn't just marry him, she honored him, and in doing so, she shattered the foundation of everything the South believed in. The widow's choice wasn't about love alone. It was about freedom, the kind that neither chains nor class could define. In a world where women were property and slaves were shadows, Eleanor, Wren, and Moses dared to stand in the light. The South never forgave Moses. Even as the ashes cooled and time began to blur the fire that had devoured the Wren plantation, whispers of the man who had risen from bondage refused to die. To some, he was a monster, a murderer, a blasphemy against the order of things. But to others, especially to those who still felt the sting of chains, Moses was something far more powerful, a symbol that a slave could become a master, that a man born into silence could make the world tremble with his name. After the fire, Moses and Eleanor began the slow and dangerous work of rebuilding. The land was scarred, blackened by soot and memory. The fields where men once bled under the whip now lay silent beneath layers of ash. Yet, instead of restoring it to its former cruelty, Moses envisioned something different, something that had never existed in the South before. He called it New Promise. No one had ever seen a plantation like it. There were no overseers, no whips, no chains. The men and women who came there were not slaves, but workers. They were paid, housed, fed, and respected. Moses knew that freedom meant nothing without dignity, and dignity meant nothing without the chance to build something with one's own hands. The first year was brutal. The white landowners around him conspired to starve them out. They refused to sell seed, tools, or livestock to a colored man who had once been property. Merchants doubled prices. Churches preached sermons about God's wrath upon sinners who defied natural order. Men rode at night, firing shots into the air near the edge of Moses' land, warnings written in gunpowder and hate. But Moses did not bend. He had survived worse than their threats. He had endured iron and fire, loss and blood. He worked the fields with his own hands from sunrise to dusk, Eleanor beside him, her once smooth palms blistered but her resolve unshaken. Slowly, others began to arrive, runaway slaves, freedmen, widows, and children with nowhere to go. They found safety there, under the protection of the man who had once lived in the very chains they fled. They built homes from the ruins. They planted new crops in the charred soil, and against every curse spoken in town, the land flourished. The cotton that grew from that soil was softer, whiter, cleaner than any the South had seen. Some said it was luck. Others whispered it was justice. But what truly made Moses a legend was not the crops. It was the community. He created a place where people called each other brother and sister, where children were taught to read, where the old and sick were fed, and where no man raised a hand in cruelty. He refused to replicate the world that had broken him. He built the opposite. Every night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the people of New Promise would gather outside the rebuilt house that once belonged to Colonel Wren. Moses would stand on the porch, silent for a while, watching them. Men who once feared the crack of a whip now laughing freely. Women who once hid their faces now holding their children close. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep, slow, and certain. "We don't bow no more," he'd say. "Not to men, not to fear, not to ghosts." Those words spread beyond his land like wind through the cotton. Within a year, other freedmen from nearby counties began to seek him out, to learn from him, to follow him. They called him the Black Moses, not just for his name, but for what he represented: a deliverer who had led his people out of bondage into a new kind of promised land. But legends come at a cost. The more powerful Moses became, the more enemies he gathered. The white elites of Georgia saw him not as a man, but as a threat, a living challenge to everything they believed in. They sent sheriffs to investigate him, preachers to shame him, and finally, men in masks to destroy him. One night in the summer of 1831, riders came again. Torches, hoods, rifles. They surrounded the property, calling out his name, demanding he surrender the land he had stolen. But Moses was not a man who ran. The story goes that he walked out onto the porch unarmed. As the flames of their torches flickered in the night, Eleanor stood behind him, her pistol in hand. The riders shouted threats, cursed him, spat his name. Moses only said, "You can burn what's mine, but you can't burn what I've built." The riders charged forward. Shots rang out. The fire spread again. But when the dawn broke, the field was empty. The riders were gone. So were Moses and Eleanor. Some claimed they escaped north and started again under new names. Others believed they died together that night, their bodies lost to the flames. But a few, the ones who had lived under his roof and worked his land, swore they saw him after that, walking the edges of the old plantation, watching over the people who still tended the soil. In time, the name New Promise faded from maps, but never from memory. The people who had lived there carried its story wherever they went. They told their children and grandchildren about the man who had risen from chains to build a kingdom, not of gold or power, but of mercy and freedom. Moses became more than flesh and bone, he became legend. His story lived in the songs sung by freedmen after the Civil War, in the prayers whispered by field hands when the overseer's back was turned, and in the defiant hope of anyone who ever dared to dream of justice. And when travelers passed through Georgia years later, some said that on still summer nights, when the air hung heavy and the cicadas sang, you could see a tall figure standing in the fields where the Wren plantation once stood. A man with eyes like fire and a presence like thunder, guarding the soil he had bled for. That was Moses, not just a man who survived, but one who rose. The man who built a kingdom from ashes. The man who turned tragedy into legend. History does not always reward its heroes. Sometimes it buries them beneath the very soil they liberated. And that is exactly what happened to Moses. The man who rose from slavery, killed his master, married the widow, and built a new world from ashes. For years after his disappearance, the name Moses lingered like smoke in the air of Georgia. People whispered it in taverns, in churches, and on the edges of cotton fields. Some spoke it with awe, others spat it with hate. But as decades passed, something strange began to happen. The story of Moses began to fade. It wasn't because people forgot. It was because they were made to. After the events of that fiery night in 1831, white landowners and politicians understood the danger that Moses' memory posed. To them, he was not just a man. He was an idea. The idea that slaves could rise, could fight, could win. And that idea was poison to the South's fragile order. So, they did what history often does to uncomfortable truths. They erased him. The local newspapers that once sensationalized his rebellion suddenly stopped printing his name. Church records, county documents, and plantation registries that had once listed him as property quietly vanished. The courthouse clerk who had registered the sale of the Wren plantation after the colonel's death suddenly found that the deed was missing. By 1840, not a single official record remained. Even Eleanor, the widow who had once been called a traitor to her race for marrying Moses, was wiped away. It was said she had died of fever, though no grave was ever marked. Others claimed she had fled north, carrying what little gold and memory she could. But in the ledgers of the county, she simply ceased to exist. And so, in the span of a few years, Moses, the giant of Georgia, the man who defied a world built on chains, became a ghost. But the poor remembered, the freedmen remembered. In the hush of night, when the fields were quiet, and the wind carried the scent of old cotton and wet soil, old men would tell the story of the slave who became the master. They spoke of his strength, his voice, his justice. They said he could crush a man's skull with his hands but refused to strike a child. They said he built a place called New Promise, where the whip never cracked and where no one knelt before another. Those stories became whispers passed through generations, too dangerous to speak loudly, too sacred to let die. After the Civil War, when freedom came to the South in name but not in spirit, Northern journalists flooded Georgia to document the new era. Among them were abolitionists who had heard faint rumors of a black man who once owned land and freed slaves decades before the war. They searched for evidence, but they found nothing, not a stone, not a deed, not a grave. The records had been cleansed too well. Still, one reporter from New York claimed to have found something. A rusted iron key buried near the ruins of what locals called the Promise Fields. It bore the engraving M.W. Liberty is the only inheritance worth dying for. He wrote a small article about it in 1868. It ran for one day. Then it disappeared, pulled from circulation before it could spread. Even after emancipation, the South was not ready for Moses. The story of a slave who killed his master and rose to power contradicted the comforting narrative white historians wanted to tell. That slavery had ended because of moral awakening, not because of rebellion and blood. And so Moses' story was left out of the textbooks. His fields were plowed over. His house was rebuilt and sold to another family who never knew whose ghosts haunted its soil. But memory is like water. It finds its way through cracks, through generations, through silence. By the early 1900s, black sharecroppers in Georgia still sang work songs about Big Moses. The lyrics shifted from place to place, but the message never changed. He rose up tall, with fire in his hand, broke the chains, took back the land. In those songs, Moses was no longer a man. He was a myth, part truth, part legend, entirely immortal. Even white historians who stumbled across fragments of his story in old letters and estate logs didn't know what to make of him. Some dismissed him as fiction, a folktale of the Reconstruction era. Others speculated he had been inspired by the biblical Moses, that he never existed at all. But a few, the ones who read too closely, began to see a pattern: burned plantations, missing records, and one name that appeared in slave registries and then vanished, Moses Wren. That name resurfaced once more in 1921, when a historian from Savannah visited an elderly freedwoman who claimed to have been raised on New Promise Plantation as a girl. She described Moses as a tall, broad man with eyes that looked like thunder before rain. When the historian asked what became of him, she simply said, "He ain't gone. He's waiting. The land's still his." And that, perhaps, is the truest legacy of Moses. Not the erased papers or vanished deeds, but the belief that he never left. Every southern town has its ghosts. Most are born from tragedy, but Moses' ghost was born from truth, too powerful to kill, too dangerous to remember. The soil that had once held him still trembled with his defiance, his name whispered in the rustle of the fields. His story kept alive in the blood of those who refused to forget. And that's how legends survive, not through ink and paper, but through memory and defiance. So, while Georgia may have tried to erase him and history may have chosen silence, the people, the poor, the enslaved, the forgotten, made sure Moses lived on, not as a man to be recorded, but as a spirit to be remembered, a symbol for every soul who ever dreamed of freedom in a land built on chains. Eleanor Wren was born into everything the South told a woman she should want: wealth, beauty, and a husband who owned more than 300 human souls. Her life, from the lace of her dress to the servants who brushed her hair, was built on slavery. Yet, beneath that fragile mask of privilege, Eleanor lived a quiet kind of torment, one that only grew heavier as she began to see the world her husband ruled. Before Moses ever entered her story, Eleanor's life was already cracking. Her husband, Colonel Wren, was not just cruel to his slaves. He was cruel to her. Behind the polished columns of their grand plantation house, Eleanor endured what so many Southern wives endured in silence: the constant humiliation, the whispered affairs, the violence that never made it past the parlor door. To society, she was a blessed woman. Inside, she was a prisoner too, gilded, but chained all the same. Then came Moses. At first, he was simply another man in her husband's shadow, tall, silent, with a presence that unsettled every other soul on the plantation. There was something unyielding in him, a quiet strength that didn't belong to the brokenness of slavery. Eleanor noticed it the first time she saw him. The way he didn't flinch when her husband raised his voice, the way his eyes met hers without fear. That brief exchange became a mirror, one that showed Eleanor everything wrong in her world. For the first time, she realized that her comfort, her safety, her very life were bought by the suffering of others. But guilt was only the beginning. It turned to horror when she discovered what the colonel had done to the slaves in his cellar. a truth so dark it broke something inside her. When she saw what Moses had endured, when she realized that her husband's cruelty was not just sin but sickness, she began to change. She stopped attending the social dinners. She stopped smiling for the plantation wives who gossiped about dresses and tea, while people screamed in fields they pretended not to see. And then came the night of blood. When Moses struck down the colonel, Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't call for help. She simply stood there, still as the old oak outside, watching the life drain from the man who had destroyed so many others. In that moment, she wasn't the colonel's wife anymore. She was free. But freedom came at a cost. When the law came hunting, Eleanor did something no one expected. She lied for Moses. She claimed it had been self-defense, that her husband had turned his rage toward her, and Moses had saved her life. It was a dangerous lie, one that could hang her if discovered. But she spoke it calmly, her voice steady as if she were reciting a prayer. In the weeks that followed, she made an even bolder choice. She married Moses. To the south, it was a sin beyond forgiveness, a white widow marrying a black man in 1831. It was rebellion in its purest form, a union that shattered everything the world believed about class, race, and order. The plantation wives whispered that she was possessed, cursed, bewitched. Her own family disowned her, her name struck from their records. But Eleanor didn't care. For the first time in her life, she was not living for appearances. She was living for truth. With Moses, she rebuilt the plantation as a sanctuary. Together they freed the remaining slaves, tore down the whipping post, and turned the estate into new promise. She taught children to read under the shade of magnolia trees. She read the Bible not as a book of justification, but as a book of deliverance. In the evenings, she and Moses would sit on the veranda and watch the horizon, as if daring the world to come for them. Yet, despite her peace, Eleanor was haunted, not by what she lost, but by what she had ignored for so long. She carried the ghosts of the women who had served her, of the mothers whose children were sold while she looked away. She carried guilt like a second skin. Her redemption was not loud or proud. It was quiet, painful, and constant. She sought forgiveness not through prayer alone, but through action. She cared for the wounded, hid runaway slaves traveling north, and offered food to the families of freedmen who had nowhere else to go. But redemption in the South is a dangerous thing, especially for those who cross its lines. Rumors began to spread that she and Moses were building an army, that their sanctuary was a breeding ground for rebellion. White men from nearby plantations gathered in secret, whispering about restoring order. And one moonless night, a mob rode to New Promise. They burned the chapel first. The flames swallowed the night sky, painting Eleanor's face in orange and ash. Moses fought, but there were too many. They said Eleanor ran back into the burning house to retrieve the Bible Moses had carved her name into. And that was the last time anyone saw her alive. When dawn came, New Promise was nothing but smoldering ruin. But those who searched the ashes never found Eleanor's body. Some said she died in the fire. Others claimed she escaped into the swamps and lived among freed slaves under another name. Years later, travelers would speak of an old woman in white who roamed the marshlands near Savannah, feeding orphans, whispering prayers, and vanishing when approached. Some called her a ghost. Others swore she was Eleanor, the widow who defied the South. Eleanor's redemption was never about cleansing herself of guilt. It was about facing it. She became a symbol of what it meant to awaken too late, yet still choose to fight. She had been born into sin, complicit in cruelty, yet she died or disappeared, trying to undo it. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful form of redemption, not the absence of sin, but the courage to stand against it once you finally see it. To the South, she remained a traitor. To history, she became a ghost. But to those who whispered her name in secret, she was something more. Proof that even in a world built on hatred, love and truth could still bloom from the ashes. The plantation once called Wren's Pride was reborn under a new name, New Promise. To the locals, it was an abomination. To the enslaved and the forgotten, it was a miracle. But to Moses and Eleanor, it was a dangerous dream built on the bones of the past. For a time, peace lived there. The air no longer echoed with the crack of the whip. The soil that once drank the blood of the broken now grew wheat, tobacco, and cotton tended by free hands. Moses paid every worker in coin. Eleanor taught children to read by candlelight in the old overseer's house. Together, They made New Promise a sanctuary in a land still soaked in sin. But the South has never been kind to those who rewrite its rules. The surrounding plantations looked on with fury and fear. The sight of a black man sitting at the head of a table once reserved for his master was enough to ignite hatred in hearts that had never known equality. The white men of Georgia whispered in secret, their envy festering like a wound. They called Moses the devil's favorite, a man who'd seduced a white widow and stolen what no black man was ever meant to hold power. By the summer of 1833, the rumors had become weapons. Newspapers printed stories calling New Promise a haven of rebellion. Local preachers thundered that God's wrath would strike down the union of darkness and sin. And in the taverns of nearby Savannah, drunken planters vowed to end Moses's reign before it spread. But while they schemed, Moses built something greater than a plantation. He built a family. He gathered former slaves from neighboring lands, men and women too old or too broken to run north. He gave them shelter and food, and he made them swear a single oath that no man would be owned again on that soil. They planted side by side, black and white workers together, and New Promise began to flourish. The cotton Moses sold was cleaner, softer, and cheaper than any grown on slave labor. His profits rose, and with every coin earned, his enemies sharpened their knives. The first act of violence came quietly, a field fire one night in late autumn. The second came louder, a young freedman found hanging from an oak at the edge of the property, a warning written on his chest in blood. Go back to your place. Galanor begged Moses to leave, to take their people north before it was too late. But Moses refused. He had spent his life running, and he would not run again. If I leave now, he told her, they will tell the world a black man can build nothing without a white man's permission. And I won't let them have that. So they stayed. And then came the night that history remembers only in whispers. The rebellion of New Promise. It began with the sound of hooves. Dozens of riders stormed the gates, their torches blazing like false stars. They were planters, sheriffs, bounty men, the self-proclaimed guardians of order. Their faces were hidden beneath cloth hoods, but their intent was bare and brutal. They shouted for Moses, calling him out by name. Eleanor stood on the balcony, white dress glowing in the firelight, refusing to hide. Moses met the mob at the gates with his men beside him, freed slaves holding shovels, axes, and rifles salvaged from fallen soldiers of wars long past. The first shot came from the dark. It struck the bell above the chapel, shattering the silence that had lingered since the plantation's rebirth. The battle that followed was not one of glory, it was chaos. Smoke, screams, gunfire, and fire. The chapel went up first, its wooden beams collapsing like a crucifix. The fields burned next, the cotton turning to black ash under the glow of vengeance. Moses fought like a man possessed, not for survival, but for legacy. Every swing of his rifle, every cry he let out was an answer to centuries of chains. Don't let them take it back, he shouted as he fell into the chaos. Eleanor, refusing to leave, took the wounded into the cellar. She tore her silk gown into bandages, her pale hands trembling as she pressed them to wounds that refused to close. The fire crawled closer, licking the walls like a beast that wanted to erase them both from the world. When dawn broke, New Promise was gone. All that remained were ashes, a scorched Bible, and the faint outlines of two people who had dared to believe love could rewrite history. The mob disappeared back into their towns, boasting that they had restored the natural order, but no one ever found Moses's body. Some claimed he died in the blaze, others swore they saw him fleeing into the woods, carrying Eleanor in his arms. Weeks later, travelers on the back roads of Georgia began to speak of a hidden settlement deep in the swamps, a place where freedmen lived in peace, led by a tall, quiet man with eyes like storm clouds. They called it the Second Promise. No lawman ever found it. No white man ever dared to enter. But the legend of that night, of Moses the slave who became a master of his own destiny, spread across the South like wildfire. It was whispered in fields, sung in work songs, and etched in the hearts of the enslaved. For every man who swung a whip, the story became a warning. For every soul in chains, it became hope. The rebellion of New Promise wasn't just about fire and blood. It was about transformation. It proved that rebellion doesn't always begin with armies. Sometimes it begins with a single man refusing to bow. And though the plantation burned to nothing, its ashes became a seed that grew in secret, watered by the memory of those who believed that even in hell, freedom was worth the flames. The legend of New Promise spread faster than the smoke that once rose from its ashes. Across Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas, whispers of Moses, the slave who had killed his master, married his widow, and built a free land, began to travel like forbidden gospel. For those in chains, it was hope. For those who wore badges or carried whips, it was rebellion. And in the eyes of the powerful, hope and rebellion were the same sin. After the fire, many believed Moses had perished, but he hadn't. For months, he and a small band of survivors lived hidden in the marshes south of Savannah, deep within a labyrinth of cypress and mist where no white man dared to go. They lived off the land, fishing by night, trapping by day, and praying in secret under the faint light of lanterns covered with cloth. To his followers, Moses had become something more than a man. He was a symbol, a living myth that walked among them. They called him the Deliverer. He never sought that name, but he didn't refuse it either. He began to organize small raids at night, freeing enslaved men and women from nearby plantations and guiding them into the swamp. Each one who came added to his growing refuge. A hidden world where, for the first time, black men and women made their own laws, built their own homes, and spoke freely without fear of the lash. But peace never lasts where power is threatened. News of this Black Kingdom reached the ears of the state governor, who quietly issued a bounty for Moses' capture, alive if possible, dead if necessary. The price was $2,000, an unimaginable sum for most men in 1834. It was enough to buy a plantation, a lifetime of security, or damnation for whoever tried to claim it. The hunt began not with soldiers, but with whispers. Spies were sent, field hands bribed with gold, freedmen threatened with chains. And one of them, desperate to save his family, betrayed the man who had saved him. His name was Caleb. Caleb had once been a runaway that Moses took in and healed after a brutal whipping. For months, he worked beside him, planting crops and singing hymns at night. But when his wife was captured by bounty men and threatened with sale to Mississippi, Caleb made a deal with the devil. He offered Moses' location in exchange for her life. He wept when he told them, but he told them nonetheless. The betrayal came on a moonless night in spring. The swamp was silent except for the croak of frogs and the whisper of wind through reeds. Moses had just finished leading a prayer when the gunfire started. Dozens of men poured into the camp, torches burning, dogs howling. The swamp turned into chaos, screams splashing water, flashes of gunpowder. Moses fought, but he was outnumbered. He took down 3 men before a musket ball ripped through his shoulder. He fell to his knees in the mud, blood soaking through his shirt, and still he tried to rise. When they finally dragged him out, bound and bleeding, the bounty men stared at him like he was something otherworldly. Part man, part myth. Even chained, he stood taller than them all. "Do what you came for," Moses said, his voice steady. "But remember this, if you kill me, 1,000 will rise where I fall." They didn't kill him. Not yet. The bounty men paraded him through the streets of Savannah like a trophy. People came out of their homes to see the black demon, who had defied the South. Some spat at him, others stared in silence. The women crossed themselves. The children whispered stories they barely understood. He was thrown into the Savannah jail, a stone fortress where air barely moved and the walls smelled of rust and rot. They said he spent days in silence, praying, humming old hymns under his breath. Eleanor's fate remained a mystery. Some claimed she'd been captured too. Others whispered she'd escaped north. Moses said nothing. Not about her, not about the plantation, not about the men who hunted him. But inside that dark cell, something else began to spread, something stronger than fear. Slaves from nearby plantations snuck close to the jail at night, placing candles on the ground outside the walls. White townsfolk began reporting strange songs drifting through the streets at midnight, old spirituals that spoke of fire, rivers, and deliverance. The guards tried to stop it, but the music never ceased. Within weeks, Moses the legend was no longer a man. He was an idea. When the trial began, it drew crowds from every corner of the South. The courtroom was packed so tightly that people stood on windowsills to see. The judge demanded silence. But the moment Moses was brought in, the room fell into a heavy hush. He was thinner now, weaker from the infection in his wound, but his eyes burned with a strange calm. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Moses rose, chains clinking, blood still seeping through the bandage on his shoulder. and spoke only this: "You call it murder. I call it justice long delayed." Those were his last public words. The judge sentenced him to hang. The date was set for the first Sunday of summer, 1834. But when the morning came, the gallows stood empty. Sometime in the night, a fire had broken out in the jail. 3 guards died, the rest fled. And Moses, along with 2 other prisoners, vanished into the darkness. Some said he escaped with help from abolitionists who bribed a guard. Others believed Eleanor herself set the fire, returning from wherever she had hidden to free the man she loved. No one ever knew for certain. All that remained was a single message, carved into the stone wall of his cell, barely visible beneath the suit. Freedom's price is never too high, only too late. From that day forward, no one ever caught Moses again. But his legend grew stronger with each telling, the story of a man who paid the price for freedom and walked out of hell unbroken. To some, he was a murderer. To others, a prophet. But to those who still labored under the lash, Moses was something more. Proof that even in a world built to break them, a slave could rise, fight, and vanish into freedom. When the jail burned and Moses vanished, the South trembled. Not because one man had escaped, but because his story refused to die. The legend of Moses the Deliverer spread like wildfire through fields, cabins, and churchyards. It was carried not by paper or ink, but by whispers, songs, and the trembling voices of those who had seen just enough of the truth to believe the rest. They said he had turned into smoke and vanished into the night. Others swore they saw him walking on the edge of the river at dawn, blood still fresh on his shirt, but his chains gone. Some claimed he had been taken north by abolitionists. Others insisted he still roamed the swamps, freeing slaves and striking down cruel overseers. No one knew where he was, but everyone believed he was. In a world where a slave's life could be erased with a signature, belief itself became rebellion. The first songs about Moses began in secret gatherings beneath the moon. On Sunday nights, when the master's eyes were heavy from whiskey and the fields were silent, the enslaved would gather deep in the woods, hidden from sight, yet bound together by something stronger than fear. They called these meetings hush harbors, and in those hidden sanctuaries they sang. At first the songs were simple, coded prayers for safety, freedom, and strength, but soon a new name began to echo between the trees. Moses done gone north, fire in his hand, chains fall forth. Ride on, Moses, ride on fast. The devil's sleepin'. The whip won't last. The song spread faster than any message ever could. From the Carolinas to Louisiana, slaves began to hum it under their breath as they worked. Overseers heard the tune but never understood the words. They thought it was just another work song. They never realized it was a call to rise. Every verse told a different version of his story. In some, Moses was a ghost who walked at night, freeing the chained. In others, he was still alive, building a city of the free deep in the southern swamps. The songs changed from plantation to plantation, but the message remained: freedom could not be killed. But for the masters, the legend brought terror. Plantation owners began hearing rumors of revolts. Plans whispered in the dark, strange symbols carved into tree bark, fields left untended in defiance. Overseers who punished too harshly began disappearing. Some bodies were found floating in the river, their whips missing. Others were never found at all. The mere mention of Moses' name sent shivers through white towns. The Black Ghost, they called him. The Devil's Slave. Newspapers described him as a murderer, a seducer, a dangerous revolutionary. But the more they tried to demonize him, the stronger his legend grew. Every attempt to erase him only made him larger. It wasn't long before even free black preachers began invoking his name in sermons. Carefully, cautiously, they drew parallels between the biblical Moses, who led his people out of bondage, and the man who had done the same in Georgia. "Our Moses walks among us," they whispered to their congregations, and the Pharaoh still trembles. For many enslaved people, that idea was enough to keep them alive. The thought that one man had defied the system and lived was more powerful than any army. In the years that followed, reports of a tall, dark figure began to surface across the South. Travelers along the Savannah River claimed they saw him leading groups through the fog. Plantation guards reported empty cabins, missing horses, and tracks that disappeared into the woods. Every time something went wrong, a barn burned, a slave escaped, an overseer vanished, people said the same thing: Moses did it. And though no one could prove he still lived, it didn't matter. His ghost was enough. Slave owners began hiring more guards, building fences, and banning certain hymns. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was outlawed on some plantations after men were found missing the next morning. But songs like Fire have a way of slipping through cracks. They sang softer, but they never stopped. By the 1840s, abolitionists in the North had heard of him too. Pamphlets began circulating in Boston and Philadelphia, describing a mysterious fugitive slave known only as Moses, who freed hundreds before vanishing into the wilderness. Some claimed he was hiding in Canada. Others said he had joined the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman herself would later be called Moses. And some historians believe her nickname came from the legend of the original one. The story of a slave who freed others before disappearing became a beacon of inspiration, passed from generation to generation. What had begun as a whisper in a swamp had become a movement. But there was another side to the myth. One darker, one the South preferred not to speak of. In towns near the river, white men told stories of a curse. They said that anyone who tried to profit from Moses's land or blood met an unnatural fate. Crops failed, barns caught fire, and sons went missing. Even Eleanor's name became haunted. Some said her ghost wandered the ruins of the plantation, waiting for Moses to return. Whether these were tales of guilt or warning, no one knew. But one truth lingered through it all: the South could not silence him. Moses had become a mirror, reflecting both the hope of the enslaved and the terror of the enslavers. His name was spoken in chains and in freedom, in fields and in churches, in whispers and in songs. And even decades after his time, long after slavery was abolished, elderly freedmen still told stories of the giant who rose from bondage, loved a white widow, burned his master's house, and vanished into legend. A preacher in 1899 put it best during a sermon to a small congregation of freedmen in Savannah: "There are two kinds of men, the ones who die, and the ones who become stories. Moses was both, and we are the proof he lived." In the end, it didn't matter whether Moses had survived or not. The world he dreamed of, a place where the enslaved could stand unbroken, had already begun to take shape in the hearts of his people. He had become what the South feared most: a story they could never kill. When the smoke cleared and the plantation lay in ashes, Eleanor Harper was the only one left standing among the ruins. The mistress who once dined on silver and silk now walked barefoot through the charred remains of her own home. The man she had called her husband was gone, dead by the hands of his former slave. And the man she had once called her forbidden love, Moses, had vanished into myth. But what the world didn't know, what she carried in silence, was the child. It was 1839 when Eleanor gave birth in secret, under the dim light of an attic window in a small cabin far from the plantation grounds. The child was born with the skin of dusk and the eyes of storm clouds. Neither white nor black, neither free nor slave, neither master nor servant. He was the living echo of two worlds that were never meant to touch. She named him Samuel, after her father, though she knew he bore the blood of Moses. Eleanor hid him from the world. She moved north under a false name, claiming widowhood from a fever that had taken her husband and home. The society women of Charleston pitied her, thinking her quiet sorrow a sign of fragile grace. But inside, Eleanor lived with a burning truth, half love, half curse. At night, when Samuel slept, she would sit by the window and whisper stories of his father. "Your father was a giant, Samuel, not in size but in spirit. He was born in chains but died unbound." She taught him to read from the only book she'd saved, the family Bible. Between verses of Exodus and Psalms, she would tell him about the night the world burned. She wanted him to know the truth, not the version whispered in southern parlors, where his father was called a savage murderer, but the one sung in secret by those who understood what freedom cost. Yet even in her exile, the past found her. One cold autumn evening, a letter arrived at her door. It bore no name, just a wax seal shaped like a cross. Inside, a single line was written in a familiar, rough hand: "Keep him hidden. They still hunt my blood." Her hands trembled. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt her heart awaken. "He's alive," she whispered. From that day, she became even more careful. She stopped attending church. She moved again, this time to a small village outside Savannah, where no one knew her face or name. She told the locals her husband had died in the war, and that her boy's father had been a merchant from the north. But rumors travel faster than truth. Neighbors began to whisper that the widow's son was unnatural. His skin was too dark for her lineage. Too light for the colored schools. When Samuel turned 10, other children began to taunt him, calling him devil's child, witchborn, slave blood. Eleanor would pull him close at night, holding him as if she could shield him from a world that refused to see his humanity. "Never bow your head," she told him. "Your father didn't, and neither will you." By the time Samuel was 16, he was tall and broad-shouldered, his father's image in every way except his eyes, which were his mother's. He asked questions she feared to answer. "Why can't I go to town, Mama?" "Because the world is not ready for you, my son." "And what of my father? You always say he was a giant, but where did he go?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Giants do not die. They become storms." It wasn't long after that conversation that men came to the village asking questions. Two strangers, dressed in fine coats, visited the local inn. They carried an old sketch of a woman and a baby. "We're looking for this woman," they said. "She's wanted in Georgia." Eleanor knew they would come someday. The Harper family name still carried power, and power never forgets disgrace. That night, she packed a small satchel, woke Samuel, and said the words she had dreaded for years. "It's time to run." They fled into the woods, just as Moses had once done. The moonlight guided them through the trees, and the sound of dogs echoed in the distance. Samuel ran ahead, his long strides strong and sure. Eleanor followed as best she could, her breath ragged but her resolve unbroken. When they reached the river, Eleanor stopped. "Go," she said. "Follow the water north. There's a safe house beyond the ridge. Tell them your father's name. Tell them you are Moses' son." Samuel shook his head. "I won't leave you!" But she pressed her hand to his cheek and smiled a sad, knowing smile. "You are his legacy, Samuel. You are what they feared most. Go, my son, live." As he hesitated, the sound of horses grew near. Without another word, Eleanor turned and ran in the opposite direction, drawing the pursuers away. Samuel watched as the shadows swallowed her. He never saw her again. Days later, he found refuge among a group of freedmen who worked for the Underground Railroad. They took him in, and when he told them his name, they looked at each other with wide eyes. "Moses' boy." One of them whispered. The legend lives on. Under their protection, Samuel reached Philadelphia. There he joined the abolitionist cause, printing pamphlets, helping fugitives cross into safety, and writing under a pseudonym S. Harper. His writings would later be found among the archives of early emancipation literature. Fiery words that spoke of justice, blood, and rebirth. No one ever knew who he truly was. But among those who remembered, whispers remained Moses had a son. As for Eleanor, her fate was recorded only in a local coroner's note. Unknown white woman found drowned near the Savannah River. Presumed accident. But some said they saw her ghost wandering the banks at night, whispering a name to the wind. Moses bring him home. Years later, Samuel returned to the ruins of the plantation. All that remained was a single iron gate and the burned-out frame of the main house. He knelt in the ashes and placed a hand on the earth. "This is where you freed us," he said softly. From that day on, he dedicated his life to building schools for freed children across Georgia and South Carolina. He refused to take credit or wealth, insisting that every brick, every lesson, was a tribute to the two souls who had given him life, the slave who became a legend, and the mistress who dared to love him. Eleanor's story faded from history books, but not from the hearts of those who carried her blood. She became the ghost of redemption, a woman who had crossed the boundaries of race, class, and law, and paid for it with everything she had. Her name was erased, her story twisted, but her legacy endured. In the songs of freedom, in the faces of the children Samuel taught, and in the endless echo of the river where she made her final stand. In the end, the woman who had once been a symbol of sin became something far greater, a bridge between two worlds. Long after the ashes of the Harper plantation cooled and the bodies beneath them turned to dust, whispers of Moses lived on, not in books or sermons, but in the trembling voices of those who had seen what no one dared speak. His story was not written in ink, but in blood, memory, and fear. Every freed slave who heard it carried it like a hidden scripture, a tale of vengeance, redemption, and the impossible dream of equality. By the mid-1840s, the slave who became a master had become a ghost story to some, a prophecy to others. Mothers told it to their children by candlelight, warning them that no chain holds forever. On the plantations of Georgia and South Carolina, Where cruelty was inherited like land, overseers claimed that the mere mention of Moses's name could spark rebellion. They called it the curse of Harper's Land, a name spoken only in whispers. But for the enslaved, it was not a curse. It was hope. They told of a man who rose up, not just against a master, but against the system itself, who took back his humanity in a single, thunderous act. It wasn't the murder that gave the legend its power. It was what came after. They said Moses didn't die that night, that he escaped into the swamps, that he became something immortal. Some claim to have seen him years later, leading runaways through the marshes, carrying a torch in one hand and a rusted key in the other, the key that once locked his own chains. To his people, he became a symbol. To his enemies, a nightmare. Decades passed, and the Civil War tore through the South like divine judgment. Towns burned, men bled, and empires built on the backs of slaves began to crumble. In 1863, when Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation echoed across the land, there were old slaves who knelt and whispered, "Moses has come again." They didn't mean the prophet of Scripture. They meant him, the giant who defied the South long before freedom had a name. In the chaos of war, Moses's tale evolved. Some said he had become a preacher hiding under a false name, leading an army of freedmen. Others swore his ghost appeared on plantations just before uprisings. A towering figure in the dark, silent but unyielding. There were reports of an unnamed man freeing entire families from bondage, moving by night through Georgia and Alabama. They called him the Night Walker. No one could prove he was real, but no one could disprove it either. The Confederacy fell, but the South did not heal easily. Hatred remained, hiding behind laws and uniforms. Even then, in the silence of the Reconstruction years, when black voices were once again pushed aside, stories of Moses resurfaced. Freedmen built schools and churches named Moses' Mission, Harper's Hope, and New Liberty. The name itself became a code, a reminder that freedom, once taken by blood, could not be returned by chains of law. Eleanor's son, Samuel, grew into a man whose fire matched his father's. Though he never saw Moses again, he carried the legend inside him like a torch that would never go out. He became a teacher first, then a writer, and then an organizer, helping to establish one of the earliest African-American mutual aid societies in the South. Under his pseudonym S. Harper, he wrote words that lit hearts on fire. "My father was a slave. My mother was his master's widow. Together they taught me that sin is not born from color, but from cruelty, and that freedom is a birthright no man can deny." Those lines appeared in a small abolitionist newspaper in Philadelphia in 1871. No one knew the author's true identity, but those who had heard the legend of Moses recognized the truth in every word. Samuel's writings traveled far beyond his reach, through hands of preachers, activists, and northern reformers. His message found its way into sermons, rallies, and classrooms. The story of one man's rebellion became a symbol of moral awakening, not just for the enslaved, but for a country struggling to understand what freedom meant. By the turn of the century, the legend of Moses had taken on a mythic shape. Southern whites dismissed him as folklore, a bedtime tale for the uneducated. But black communities remembered differently. They told their children that Moses had never truly died, that when justice slept, his spirit would rise again. Some even claimed that on quiet nights near the ruins of the Harper Plantation, you could still hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate, pacing through the overgrown fields. Others said that the oak tree where the master once hung runaway slaves now grew unnaturally strong, its roots clutching the bones of history. And in the moonlight, if you looked closely, you could almost see a figure standing beneath it, tall, silent, watching. As years turned into decades, the name Moses faded from official history. The textbook spoke of wars, generals, and presidents, but never of the giant slave who had struck the first true blow for his own freedom. His story was too dangerous, too raw, too honest for polite society. But beneath the surface, it endured. When the civil rights movement began in the mid-20th century, activists once again invoked his name. A preacher from Alabama, after reading an old pamphlet signed S. Harper, told his congregation, "There was another Moses before us. He didn't part a sea, he parted a silence." In that moment, the spirit of the slave who defied his master lived again. Even now, in the modern South, the legend refuses to die. Historians debate whether Moses truly existed or was an invention born of collective trauma and hope. But among descendants of those who lived on the Harper Plantation, there are records. faded letters, hidden diaries, and even a single rusted iron key kept in a museum in Charleston. No one knows whose hand once held it, but on its handle, faintly etched, are two letters MH. Moses's legacy was not just rebellion, it was transformation. He shattered the chains not only of his own body but of a society bound by cruelty and blindness. His story was a mirror to the South, forcing it to confront what it had become. Through Eleanor's sacrifice, through Samuel's words, through every soul that whispered his name, Moses became something eternal. Not a man, but a symbol. Not a murderer, but a maker. Of freedom, of justice, of truth. In the end, the plantation that once represented bondage became the birthplace of legend. And that legend became a seed, one that would grow through centuries, rising again every time injustice tried to bury it. Moses was never meant to be remembered by history. He was meant to be remembered by people, in blood, in song, and in the unbreakable belief that no master, no chain, and no fear can silence a man who has learned what freedom feels like.